All right, now I'd like to welcome Stephanie Slade, senior editor at Reason Magazine. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we're here to talk about basically the modern center right movement in politics, and sometimes we call that fusionism, which we mean the like libertarians who are sort of the anti-statist kind of people, and then the traditionalist conservatives on the other side. And for a long time in American history, both of those groups have come together and supported a lot of the same policies, certainly in terms of economic policy. Now, you are an expert on this topic, but your bio at Reason's website warns readers that fusionism, quote, probably isn't what they think it is. So, can you give us a remedial refresher course on what fusionism really is and maybe why sometimes people get it wrong?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I think the most common understanding that people have of fusionism in the American political context, to the extent that they have any sense of what that word means in that context, is kind of what you started out saying, which is, oh yeah, this was in the Cold War era. There was this coalition that formed between libertarians who believed that liberty was the highest value in life, and religious traditionalists, social conservatives who believe that virtue and tradition and order were the highest things in life. And they came together because they had this common enemy in the Soviet Union and the threat of rampaging global communism, which of course was both anti-capitalist and atheistic, militantly so. And so these two groups that had different values were able to form a political coalition during the Cold War era. This is what I think most people would say if you were to ask them to give an explanation or the history of fusionism. What I want to argue, what I often do argue, is that that's not right, not quite right at all. It's subtly wrong, but it's crucially wrong. Fusionism was a word that was coined to describe the philosophy that was articulated in the pages of National Review magazine in the 50s and 60s, mostly by a guy named Frank Meyer, who was a senior editor there. And what Frank Meyer would say, what he wrote about, was not a coalition between different groups. That was certainly a project that was happening, and his boss, William F. Buckley Jr., was an important character in bringing that coalition together. But what fusionism, the word was coined to describe, was this philosophy that Meyer was articulating that said, not libertarians and traditionalists should be willing to work together because they have a common foe, but rather liberty and virtue are both non-negotiably important. They're the two non-negotiable pillars upon which Western civilization was built, and the United States of America was founded. And so if you're a conservative, if you're on the right of center in the American context, what you need to do is to be committed. What you need to be committed to doing is to defending and preserving and protecting both liberty and virtue. So it was a philosophical synthesis and not just a sort of tactical political alliance that was suited to a particular time and place.
Okay, I think that is a sort of crucial distinction there. And which kind of brings me to my next question. I feel like when we have a lot of arguments today where some people more on the sort of traditional side or now sort of populist or nationalist conservative side say you libertarians, you just aren't willing to be tough. You aren't willing to like use these levers of political power to like defend the things that are supposedly important. And that's what we're here for. The real hardcore conservatives are here to be tough these days. um and that always means a government policy or the the government, federal, state, coming in and doing something, not voluntarily people getting together and doing what they think is great. And and to me, it seems like the question is really here the proper realms of conduct. Not that we necessarily disagree about what's important. And it's not that moral fiber and the sanctity of faith and family isn't important. It's that valuing those things isn't best done through government action, or at least that's my premise. I mean, this is kind of like when Stephen Jay Gould famously called scientific and religious truth, quote, non-overlapping magisteria. That's one of those fancy phrases that college debaters like to use. Uh, so that there are things that government does well, like fighting wars and putting people in prison. They're pretty good at that. And then there's things that voluntary communities do well, like supporting families and fostering religious faith. But can we just have each sphere do its own thing? Do we have to say, well, this is so important that we need the government to like force people to be virtuous?
That really is the fusionist contribution, is to say, hey, listen, there are these different spheres. There are the governmental sphere and the non-governmental sphere of life are different in kind, and in this really important way, which is that the government has the ability, the right, to legitimately wield violence against the people, to coerce us into doing what it wants us to do. And the rest of us don't have that right to do that to each other. So we should think very clearly, we should sort of keep in mind this important distinction between the governmental sphere, the things that the state does, wielding that coercive power in order to force us to abide by its wishes, versus everything else that happens in the non-governmental sphere of life, which doesn't necessarily just mean the marketplace. It also means the civil society institutions and social institutions, families, community organizations, all the charitable organizations, all the things that we do together to try to solve problems, all the ways that we interact with each other, all the ways that we think about the obligations that we have to each other. And all of that, we're not using coercion, hopefully, right? We're not legitimately certainly using violence in order to coerce people to do what we want. We have to find other ways to work together. And so if you begin by keeping those two spheres of life separate, clear in your mind, the separation between them, then it becomes a way to reconcile this idea that you have liberty and virtue as both these, preeminent values, which is what the fusionist claims. How can you have two number one values? Well, the answer is in the governmental sphere, the highest political value is liberty. Government exists to protect our liberty. But in the non-governmental sphere, the highest value is to pursue virtue, to pursue excellence, to pursue a good life, to be good people, right? To build a good society, to form the culture that, would shape the way that we want to live. And so you have liberty as the highest value in one sphere, in one domain, and virtue as the highest value in the other domain. And that keeping those separate and keeping those clear is the really important, I think, insight that fusionism offers us. Because what happens is if you swap them, you end up with a government that's trying to use coercion to force us to be virtuous, which is kind of a contradiction in terms as well as an invitation to tyranny. And you have people who believe that their whole part of life is to be as free as possible from all constraint, not just government coercion, but from all constraints, including social bonds and things like that, from the sort of lessons handed down through tradition and history. And that leads to, I think, something pretty awful as well, which is this sort of morally relativistic, libertinistic, hedonistic world in which everybody is just trying to seek ever greater freedom for themselves without ever thinking about the higher question of, okay, what is freedom for? What do I want to do with my freedom once I have it? So you've got to keep those high values in their proper sphere, otherwise things go very wrong.
I think it's very true. Now, when it comes to the trying to project our idea of a great society, of a good society, of a ideal society through politics, I feel like you have a couple of different motivations, which aren't always completely obvious. So you have the people, I think, who have a really genuine desire that they want to foster a good society, and in my view, are tempted to abuse the power of government to sort of try and force that on people because they think it'll be good for them. But I think you also have some people who approach this, when it comes to politics and everyone coming up with their laundry list of which political policies they think should be enforced, are approaching this almost as sort of like an intellectual game, right? Like it's Risk or it's Settlers of Catan, and the idea is we're sitting around, we're doing some sort of tabletop strategy game, and we're trying to move these pieces around, and that is really their approach. That's why they're attracted to the idea of politics. That's why they want to be in politics. That's why they want to write legislation or come up with a new policy agenda that everyone needs to follow, because they're playing this sort of kind of elaborate game where they think that they and their friends can win if they get the right pieces on the board. Do you ever feel like people are approaching this sort of like policy game that way?
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I hadn't necessarily thought of it as a game or as a strategy in that way, but I will say that a thing I have been thinking a lot about is one of the ways in which our politics has gone wrong. And I see this on the right of center within the conservative movement, is that there are, as you said, there's one group that I think has just a desire to see the country be made more virtuous. And so they say like, well, we tried your individual liberty, your limited government thing, and we don't think that it produced the virtuous outcomes that we want to see. And so now we want to seize the power of the state and wield it, be willing to wield it. You hear them say things like, we need to get comfortable wielding public power in a muscular fashion, or we need to be comfortable with a muscular conservatism or more muscular government in order to try to make government be virtuous in this way that we want to see. That's one approach where they have a vision of the good and they're just trying to, they're willing to go farther than I think conservatives once were, and libertarians certainly are, in terms of using the coercive powers in order to try to achieve that end. There's this other group though, and I see this increasingly becoming increasingly prominent, which is maybe a little bit like what you're talking about, which is, I call it will to power conservatism. It's just that they want their side to be the ones wielding power. They want their sides to be the ones in charge, and they want the people that they disagree with, their political foes, to be banished, vanquished, destroyed, defeated, eliminated. And so they treat politics as, in a sense, as a war, where one side will ultimately triumph and have an ultimate or final victory, and the other side will be destroyed and banished from society completely. And so when you think of politics as a war in this way, or as a game that can be won in a sort of ultimate fashion, then anything that goes, it's easy to justify or rationalize, saying anything goes to win the war, because once we win the war and we seize power and we banish our enemies and they're gone, then we can revert to implementing our values. We will voluntarily relinquish the power that we've seized, or we can break the rules in the near term in order to win the victory in the end, and then we can re-implement the rules that we think are important then. But right now what matters is winning, because it's war, or because it's a game that where the game has existential stakes. And so it really just becomes about, we want our in-group to be the ones who are holding power and who win, and we want the out-group to be ultimately defeated. I see a lot of that, and you actually hear a lot of people on both sides, left and right, but this has become very popular on the right in the last few years. They actually will cite Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi political philosopher who talked about politics as ultimately defined by the friend-enemy distinction. Either someone is your friend or they're your enemy. Politics exists in order to give you a means by which to seize power, wield power, reward your friends, and punish or destroy your enemies. And that's what it's about, which is actually a deeply, fundamentally different view of politics from the classical liberal view, which says politics is a way in which people who have different values can coexist peacefully together and share a society without having to defeat and destroy each other.
Well, yeah, and I think for some people in the, as you described, the will to power version of whether it's conservatism or leftism. There's plenty of leftists who will say, well, we're going to have the revolution. It's going to be a proletarian revolution. We're going to do what the Soviets did, which is liquidate the kulaks or get rid of the billionaires, and then we'll have a peaceful, tolerant society once we eliminate all the the enemies of the people. Some people are motivated like that because they are sort of bloodthirsty partisans, and they sort of relish that. I think they find it kind of emotionally satisfying. But I think there's also some people who would say, well, the reason why I'm a reasonable person. The reason why I've been forced into this will to power view of politics is because the other people are so intolerant and crazy and extreme. They made me be like this. I wanted to be a normal, reasonable person in the realm of politics. And we know that there's like psychological research about this, where you can measure how extreme you assume your enemies are. And so there's been research where people sort of over time this can change, where they say you ask them, like, what are your enemies like? And they say, oh, well, they're extreme 10 out of 10 crazy people. And they said, well, if you look at survey research, actually your median enemy is a 5, not a 10, and you're just assuming you've come to be under the impression that all of the people who are on the other team as you are super extreme when they're actually not. And so this sort of it's not exactly polarization. It's slightly different from that, where people have come to believe that the people on the other team are actually more extreme and crazy than they are, which causes them to amp up their own craziness in response. And and lead people to have this excuse. I'm not being crazy of my own accord. I'm just being extreme as a defensive tactic. I have to be extreme or I'd lose me and my people will lose everything we have. To what extent do you think this sort of political extremism is sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where people think their enemies are more extreme than they are?
I think that's definitely part of the story. I mean, this phenomenon is real, and if you work in politics or cover politics the way I do, you see it all the time. People have, almost the more educated you are, the more knowledgeable you are about politics, the more of a partisan you are, the more likely you are to have a incorrectly extreme view of what your opponents believe, right? This is what the research has shown. On the other hand, there is plenty of actual evidence on both sides that both sides can reach for and can point to justify their own desires, because the other side really is in many ways often abusing its positions of power. So I call this the abuse of power ratchet effect. Every time somebody on the right says, we must do X thing, we have no choice because the left did this other thing, they have real examples to point to justify their desire to act on their worst impulses, and vice versa. So when Biden says, or when the Democrats during the 2020 election said we need to pack, if Biden wins, he should pack the courts, for example, this was a thing. This didn't just come out of nowhere. They were pointing to the shenanigans that the Republicans in the Senate, engaged in sort of twisting the rules, abusing the norms in order to get their justices confirmed to the Supreme Court during the Trump years. And when the Republicans were doing those things during the Trump years, they were pointing back to the ways in which the Democrats had politicized the judicial nomination process and, did what was referred to during the Obama years as using the nuclear option, right? Getting rid of the filibuster for judicial appointments. And so each side is pointing back to a thing that the other side did that was considered a breach of norms, or sort of procedural expectations, at that time, and saying they did that and therefore we are justified in doing this. But each time it's a ratchet effect because each time makes the problem more extreme, right? Each person is pushing the norms or violating the norms in a more extreme way each time that this happens. So we're egging each other on, we're making each other, the two sides are making each other more extreme, and giving both camps the sort of more extreme voices on the fringes of both sides the ammunition with which to drag along the median voter or the median person on the left or the median person on the right who is not pushing, as you said, the average person, the average Democratic voter is not a socialist, for example, but the socialists are empowered when the right does crazy things to persuade their voters to go along with crazy, or their president who ran as a moderate but has been really persuaded by his base into governing as a much more extreme progressive leftist president. The two sides, the fringe voices on the two sides are empowered by the other sides acting on their worst impulses.
I think because if you had one of these old-fashioned political focus groups, you go to a Rust Belt diner or something, and and you get a half a dozen Democrats and a half a dozen registered Republicans, and you sat them down and you talked about sort of like the issues of the day, you would probably find a sort of not too dramatic kind of mushy centrist discussion of things. But if you pull back and ask someone like, well, what are the left and the right today, someone would say, oh well, it's Antifa versus the Proud Boys. That's it, right? That's the view of everyone on the left versus everyone on the right. And maybe it's something as dumb as it's more exciting, it's more interesting, it's more sort of emotionally involving to say those are the two sides, as opposed to the two sides are a 62-year-old retired plumber and a 37-year-old elementary school teacher from the same town are actually the left and the right today.
Well, the people who make our careers doing politics are also much more likely to be closer to the polls. And so this actually, what the issue where this was most clear, like vividly evident, I think, is the abortion issue, where people who work in either pro-life or pro-choice politics are vastly more likely to be in the abortion should be illegal under all circumstances, or abortion should be legal under all circumstances, 40 weeks of pregnancy right up until delivery, one of those two camps, whereas the vast majority of Americans, even those who identify as strongly pro-life or strongly pro-choice, are much closer to the middle. I mean, almost all people think that should be exceptions to one of those views, but the ones who work in these politics and therefore go on TV and talk about them and set the agenda, set the tone of the conversation around this issue are the ones who are on the two extreme poles.
Yeah, and I think you see this all the time in political rhetoric, and if you've ever been on anyone's direct mail list, and it's amazing. 20 years ago, when I started working in the nonprofit world, a little more than 20 years ago, everyone assumed that that direct mail, those fundraising letters, the actual physical ones you get in the mail, that those would go away because everything's going to be digital, everything's going to be online, everything's going to be via email. But boy, they still send them out. I don't know how many lists you're on, but those kind of printed mailers where political groups and nonprofit groups, advocacy groups try and get you to donate money to them, they have a very specific kind of writing, right? um, in high school, they probably taught you how to write the 5-paragraph persuasive essay. This writing a direct mail letter is much more technically specific than that, and they tend to all, whether it's from the left or the right or whatever topic it is, they employ a very easy to spot kind of emotive narrative, usually to get their target audience riled up and potentially donate money to the group in question. And they're almost always, sometimes explicitly, it's always a David versus Goliath fight, right? So, but the side that is trying to motivate you to give them money is always David, right? They're never Goliath, right? So, which means two things, of course, which means that they're overpowered seemingly, but also that they are, of course, ultimately the righteous side. That goes without saying. So everyone on the left says the right is in control of everything, right? The billionaires are all right wing and they control the big money. So and that's the huge power in society. And so anyone who's on the left is fighting this rearguard battle and they're barely surviving. But of course, if you read conservative direct mail, conservative fundraising pitches, they say exactly the opposite. They say the leftists are in control of everything: the government, Hollywood, the entertainment industry, publishing, the public schools. The leftists control everything. They've run the table. They've won every cultural battle of the past 50 years. And we conservatives we're hiding in a cave. There's just a few of us, Christians left alive. So one, obviously, that sets up, again, these sort of emotive perspective of people to feel besieged and maybe tempted to act more extreme than they would otherwise because they feel like their backs against the wall. But how can we possibly reconcile those, or do we just say, well, they're both BS, and so there's no reconciling them? But it seems like if you had if you had a debate, if you were putting it side by side, and there was at least an audience had to judge which side was more persuasive, the narratives are so stark and they obviously can't both be right. They might both be wrong, but they certainly can't both be right. That one side versus the other, left wing side or the right wing side, is so overwhelmingly in charge of everything in society. Do you have a sense that there's any way to judge that, or is one side have a point from a certain point of view and the other has a point from the other point of view, or is it how do we reconcile claims like that?
The problem, of course, is that there is some truth on both sides. And this is kind of what I was getting at when I said that both sides are able to point at things that the other side has done that really makes them feel like, well, this really is an existential fight. Our rights, our freedom, our very existence of my side really is on the line if we don't win this next election, or whatever the case may be. The other side really is doing things that are outrageous in many ways. So I started my career out covering religious liberty controversies during the Obama years, the ways in which people on the left wanted to use the power of the government to punish conservatives or religious traditionalist Christians who held, traditional beliefs about sex and marriage and things like that. And there still are attempts to shut down Catholic hospitals, for example, for not providing abortions, right? They want to use the power of the state to do this. The left is doing this. They're not, when the right says, we feel like we are under assault as conservative Christians or, traditionalist Christians, we feel like that the left hates us and wants to punish us and wants to we're under assault. they're not imagining it entirely, right? And the same thing goes the other way around, I think. That both sides have things that they really can point to say they want to destroy us. Therefore, the only choice we have is to fight fire with fire, to respond in kind, right? To use power the way they are willing to use power. On the other hand, I think there's, it's obviously the case that when the two sides say, well, we are always the underdog, we're always the David, and they're always the Goliath, and our side never wins, and their side has all the power, that this is a gross oversimplification of things. And even, on the right, we can look at the way I write about a lot what's going on in the conservative movement. So they'll say, well, the left has control of all the commanding heights of elite cultural institutions. They have Hollywood, they have the universities, everything you were just saying, and that they're not wrong in many ways about that. And yet there have been victories all along, all during the course of this period when the left was essentially gaining what the right calls its asymmetric advantage over the cultural institutions. The right has been winning battles all along as well, and things are getting better all the time in many ways. And the same thing goes on the other side. The left says, like, well, we have all these cultural institutions, and yet we never are able to enact our policies that we want. We still don't have Medicare for all, or whatever the case may be. It's like they're not thinking about the many victories that they have won along the way, because politics in the real life messy world that we live in is not just a one-shot game where one side wins and the other side loses and that's the end. You're constantly skirmishing here and there, and one side has an upper hand now and another side has the upper hand later, and you win some battles and you lose some battles, and it's not existential in that way, or it need not be existential in that way, that both partisans on both sides want to convince their constituents that it is. Every election is the most important election. This is politics as war. I wrote a piece about how we have this idea of politics as in the Game of Thrones sense of, you win or you die. It's not actually like that. It need not be like that. But it's much easier to turn out your base and to raise money with your direct mail letters and to get people riled up if you make them believe that this really is an existential, this is it. We win. The Flight 93 election by Michael Anton in 2016 is a perfect example. Charge the cockpit, which is to say vote for Trump or you die, was literally his argument. It's kind of unhinged from actual reality, but people are primed to believe it right now, I think, because the rhetoric has gotten so intense in the last few years.
Right. And the Anton essay was especially memorable for its analogy to the attacks of September 11th. But the phrase "this is the most important election of your lifetime," I mean, that goes back decades, right? That's that general attitude is not especially new. So one other aspect, sort of angle on this, is that again, most of the people who are in the position of sort of like pushing the boundaries on kind of becoming more extreme in politics would say, well, this is we'd like to follow the rules, but it's just too important, like you said, for all the reasons we've been talking about. And we can't lose this because it's too important, whatever that particular fight might be. But I wonder if, from the sort of like libertarian perspective, you would say, well, we don't have to fight about all of these things if they weren't all controlled by the government in the first place, right? There would be less venomous screaming matches over public school curricula if there was more school choice, right? There wasn't one set of schools that had to be controlled by one set of people at a given time. It's not so much that a left-wing school is bad and a right-wing school is good, or vice versa. It's that if we had more ability to sort ourselves according to our preferences, we wouldn't have to fight. So in a way, it's sort of a scarcity mentality almost, right? If the government is in control of everything, then you have to fight over control of the government. But if the government wasn't in control of it, then you could have yours and I could have mine, and maybe there would be fewer screaming matches about it. But so that's sort of like I think a very general kind of libertarian premise about society, and maybe reducing conflict in society. But the reason why, one potential reason why, mostly unacknowledged, I think, that some people don't go for that is that they kind of are afraid that their ideas won't be popular enough if everyone gets to make their own choice. And so they're like, well, basically the only way my side is going to win is if I force it. And so the idea of not having government control it and everyone be able to be able to decide for themselves isn't very attractive to them because they know they don't have majoritarian ideas, um, and there won't be enough support for what they want. Um, is so do you get the sense that that there is a tension between the sort of the silent majority on one side, where it is, well, I think my people are in the majority, and that's why the government should side with us because we're the right side anyway, we're the most people, or the fact that people are kind of secretly worried that their ideas aren't very popular, and which is exactly why they need the government to enforce them.
Yeah, so I sometimes write about the rise of Catholic integralism, which is this sort of theocratic, militant Catholicism. I'm Catholic, so I share many of the underlying commitments that these writers and thinkers have, but I strongly disagree with their political prescriptions, which is that they think that the state ought to be subordinated to the church, and that the government should use its power to enforce sort of the moral teachings of the Catholic Church. So one of the things you often, the most obvious response to, if you're talking to a Catholic integralist, is to say, like, there are very few we are a minority. Catholics, just Catholics, are a minority in this country to begin with, and the sort of strong traditionalist Catholics who might want to see, for example, blasphemy outlawed, or blue laws reinstated, or whatever, are an even much smaller minority. How is it that you imagine that you're going to gain this power and wield this power? And some of them, a lot of them will avoid answering that question, but the some of them, Adrian Vermeule, for example, will come right out and say, when you press them enough, he'll say, like, yeah, we're going to pass the laws anyway, and the law will teach people to understand what's right and wrong. They recognize that they're in the minority, that they can't get what they want accomplished through democratic means, and so they're looking for, and Vermeule is a particularly extreme example because he's an administrative state guy. So he says we can use the administrative state to impose these regulations on society without going through democratic, electoral means, and without worrying about the fact that they don't have the sort of democratic legitimacy of majority support, because we're right and they're wrong, and so eventually they'll come around if we force them to live under according to our values. That's the sort of thing that we ought to be very nervous about when we hear people talking about that type of strategizing, where it's openly anti-democratic. It's not, tyranny of the majority is a big enough threat in a democratic society. This is straight up tyranny of the minority, right? And so, that the fact that we're openly talking in some quarters about this, to me, is a sign that our politics really have we are becoming, the illiberalism is on the rise in our politics right now, and that's one of my main concerns about what I've been seeing, covering right of center politics, but all politics in the last few years.
Uh, well, uh, Stephanie, this has been an amazing conversation. And before we go, I want to give you a chance to make a recommendation. You have, of course, read and studied many fine exemplary political thinkers, including ones that maybe the average listener would not be familiar with. So, since we're now in Eastertide and the spirit of resurrection is among us, what writer or writers about politics would you like to resurrect from the forgotten history that you think that our listeners should read and think about?
Well, a big part of my project is sort of trying to revive the thinking of Frank Meyer, who was this senior editor at National Review, who articulated the ideas that came to be known as Fusionism. I think he's totally underrated. That does not mean he was right about everything, but I think that we have really lost sight of this insight that he had, which is that liberty and virtue are both non-negotiable. They're mutually reinforcing. They need each other. We ought to be willing to defend them both, but we also ought to keep them both in their proper spheres. And this is really important, fundamental, like 101 level first principles stuff that has really been lost from the conversation in the last few years. And so I'm trying to bring him back. So I would highly recommend people who aren't familiar with Frank Meyer looking him up. You can read some of his old essays on the National Review website, and he also had a book that you might be interested in if you're really looking to nerd out on this stuff as well.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much for being with us. And last thing, where should people find your writing?
Most of my writing is at Reason Magazine, reason.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Slade SR to see everything that I write and just also what I'm reading. And if I happen to write or publish something somewhere else, then I'll share it on Twitter as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Thank you.